Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this evening, Becoming a Literacy Leader, Rethinking Assessment, Using Universal Screening and Data to Inform Reading Instruction. My name is Joanne Bertrand, and I'm on the board of directors of the International Dyslexia Association, which is a charitable organization run by volunteers dedicated to providing information and support for people with dyslexia and their families, as well as educators and other professionals. I would like to begin with our land acknowledgement. We are acknowledging that we are meeting on Aboriginal land that has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples from the beginning. We acknowledge that IDA Ontario serves citizens on the traditional territories of the First Nations of Ontario, the Ojibwe, Chippewa, Anishinaabe, Iroquois, Mohawk, Huron-Wendat, Attawandaron, Cree and Moose Cree, Oneida, and Algonquin peoples. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this province. This acknowledgement reminds us of our responsibilities to our relationships and the ancestral lands on which we learn, share, and live. I would like to introduce our panel this evening. But first, the documents and resources for our series, including the slides, are available if you just point your camera at this QR code. Also, the chat includes a link to our Padlet resources. And so our panel this evening consists of Una Malcolm. She's a board member of IDA, and she's a reading science doctoral student. Many of you would know that already because you've attended our first session. But for those of you who are new to us, we're also welcoming back Nellie Caruso, who's a French immersion teacher in grade 2. Lee Fettis, a French immersion teacher in grade 4 and early reading, and Kate Wynn, an English teacher in kindergarten. And now, Una will be joining us.
And there we go. Thank you so much, Joanne, and welcome to everybody who has joined us. I will give you a bit of a disclaimer that I am getting over a cold, so you may hear my voice come in and out. So please have patience with that. We are so excited for everybody to join us this evening, and we're very appreciative. You'll remember when you registered for the webinar that we did ask you a fair number of survey questions, and we really appreciate your time and effort in filling that out. Firstly, because it allows us at IDA to make sure that we're meeting everybody's needs and providing the best possible support, but also because it helps us in our advocacy efforts. So we thought that it would be helpful and interesting to share back some of that data with you so you can get a sense of what other teachers are experiencing around the province. When we asked participants and registrants whether their board has, shared information with them about the Right to Read report, we were excited to see that over 60% of teachers and other educators reported that, yes, they had been notified by their board and given information about the Right to Read. So there we go. However, when we asked whether boards were supporting some of the many grassroots, ground-up, teacher-led efforts to build capacity and knowledge on reading science, almost 60% of participants mentioned that no, that their boards maybe were not necessarily supporting those book clubs or lunch and learns or other teacher-led grassroots efforts. And what was really interesting was that there were patterns of resistance that many teachers reported. And what I just did here was I just pulled out a couple of common themes that we noticed when we were looking at survey responses in terms of what people were noticing within their boards. Firstly, there were a lot of reports of just a lack of action, not necessarily taking action or moving to implement some of the recommendations of the report. Some were claiming that this move toward reading science is just the pendulum swinging in the other direction, while others were mentioning that they were very much waiting for direction from the ministry. There were some reports that boards were sharing literature or articles that directly counter the Right to Read report, perhaps, the Dr. Jim Cummins article. If just as a separate note, if that's something where you are encountering that, we at IDA did have a webinar in September where we addressed common opposition points. So if that's something where if you're encountering your board sharing articles that criticize or oppose the right to read report, that webinar might be an interesting watch for you. We heard reports that boards continue to buy ineffective teaching materials or assessment materials like LLI or the Fountas and Pinnell benchmark assessment system, or even that boards would drop in a little bit of phonemic awareness instruction while still keeping an overwhelmingly balanced literacy or 3Qing approach. Along those lines, we had comments that boards were orchestrating their professional development to still be focusing on 3Qing or other outdated, disproven approaches. And troublingly, we did read a lot that some boards were not necessarily taking advantage of professionals who have really important knowledge to share, board speech and language pathologists and psychologists. And then finally, the last common theme that we just wanted to emphasize was just a bit of a disconnect between the curriculum and the special education sides of the board in terms of those different groups potentially having different positions on their right to read and different actions being taken. So I'll say first and foremost, welcome. We're so thankful that you all could join us. This is our second webinar in this series. So if you are new and didn't join us in August for webinar 1, welcome. But I will say that we would very much encourage you to take a look at the recording from our first webinar. In that webinar, we really went through the basics of universal screening, what it is, why we need to do it, and what that looks like. I will give you a quick reminder and a quick, just to make sure we're all starting on the same page. And then in terms of our plan for this evening, I'll start with a section at the beginning, addressing some common misconceptions about screening, and then we'll open it up to our wonderful teacher panel, and we'll check in with how they're doing with their screening, what has happened in their classroom so far, and how they'll be using those screening data to inform their instruction. So first and foremost, what is universal screening and what purpose does it serve? Universal screening is a brief process done with all students. That's the universal part. And the purpose is to identify which students and which systems are at risk. So we're looking at the individual student level and also at the systems level. Now, in order for this universal screening to happen, we need to be really mindful about what tools we use to allow our screening to actually meet that goal. So if we're thinking about what type of tool we might want to use, there are a couple of criteria and a couple of look-fors. First and foremost, we need a universal screener tool to be fast. If we are doing this with every student, we can't take half an hour a student because we know that cuts into our instructional time. Is it assessment or is it screening that will improve student outcomes? No, it's the instruction. And we need to make sure that we are able to quickly and efficiently identify which students and which systems are at risk without wasting too much instructional time. So we know we need it to be fast. We also know that we need universal screeners to be reliable and valid. Now, these are statistical terms that essentially allow us to understand how much we can trust a tool. We know that our decisions are only as effective or only as valuable or as strong as the data that they are based on. So we know we need to use tools for universal screening that are reliable and valid so we can trust them. We know also that when we're doing universal screening, we need to make sure that we are capturing indicators of essential early literacy skills. And by indicators, we mean that quick little sample as a quick check of an overall set of skills. Think about it like a blood pressure check or taking somebody's temperature. It's not an indicator of their overall health. It's not tapping every single health measure, but it's a pretty quick and effective way of letting us know if there's a problem. So we know we need that indicator, and we know we need to focus that indicator on those essential early literacy skills, those skills that we know from research have causal relationships to future reading outcomes. That means we know that if we teach these effectively, or if we provide that effective instruction, we know we can expect to see improved student outcomes. Finally, we need to make sure that our universal screening tools are predictive. We can't wait for students to start to struggle. We know that all too well, that it is so difficult to intervene when a child is much older and is experiencing a reading difficulty. We know that universal screening allows us to quickly identify who is at risk and which systems are at risk when students are quite young, potentially even before they've been formally taught to learn to read. So this is our quick reminder of universal screening. We will dive a little bit more into what types of tools we would want to use for this, what we won't. We'll dive into some running record research, and we'll also chat a little bit about how this is quite challenging to make a screener that actually taps all these different criteria. And this is something that a board created or a DIY screener really could not address. So an exciting update since we've last met, buried in the press release last week from the ministry was this announcement that beginning in the next school year, so starting September 2023, there will be province-wide universal screening with kindergarten and grade 2. So obviously there are still many details that we don't know, and we don't know what that will look like, and we don't know how that will come about. But it is especially exciting that we have such a wonderful crowd here this evening, because this is an opportunity to get ahead and to really take a look at what screening is looking like in some teachers' classrooms this year, knowing that this will be in place next year for the next school year. So you'll notice also in this announcement that there is some discussion about what type of tool, whether there's a recommended list or an approved list. And while we are not sure of what that will look like in terms of what tools the ministry or boards will recommend, again, we've got those key look-fors for a screener. We want to make sure tools are fast, they're brief, they're reliable and valid. They are giving an indicator of those essential early literacy skills, those skills that we know are necessary to become a skilled, proficient reader, and that they are predictive of future performance. So we don't know what those will be. However, it is worth mentioning that in the most recent transfer payment agreement, the Ministry of Education did recognize several evidence-based reading assessments. And you'll notice that group of those first 4 are those curriculum-based measures that we discussed in our last session. So it is something where, again, we are certainly not saying that these will be on the list for the screening policy next year. However, it is worth stating that the ministry has already recognized these types of assessment as evidence-based to allow and to support for effective literacy instruction. So with all that being said, let's dive into really the meat of my first section. We had a really active chat and really some wonderful questions and answers in our last session. And I think we all felt we were only scraping the surface of it. So there were several really important questions that I would like to unpack a little bit more just before we open it up to our teacher panel, because I think we can clear up a couple of misconceptions and really take it a little bit of a step further in terms of our understanding of screening. So first of all, a question from last session was, why can't we use a running record to screen? Fine, I get that we need to screen. We need to be checking this for all beginning readers to make sure that we're giving them the instruction that they need. However, why can't we just use the DRA? So let's unpack that. First of all, it's important to mention that there are technical issues with running records, but then also more ideological issues with running records. Running records were first pioneered by Mari Clay, the developer of Reading Recovery. So they are very much grounded in whole language or 3 queuing systems. We can take a look at that. I know this is a busy slide, my apologies, but I'll try and walk you through it. This is a screenshot of a teacher record from the Teachers College Reading and Writing Project running records. This is the Lucy Calkins group out of Columbia. So you'll notice first and foremost that we've got those MSV columns over there where teachers would be analyzing student errors and student self-corrections based on which cues are being used. So meaning, syntax, or visual graphophonic cues. So again, that highlights really the tight link between running records and the 3 queuing philosophy. You'll also notice the text that students are reading. You'll notice that it is very repetitive. It's a pattern text where only, the person who teaches them is changing from line to line, likely going hand in hand with a different picture who shows that different person. And even, I'll have to move my toolbar, my apologies, and I know it's small. You'll notice here at the beginning, the instructions read, the title of this book is My Family. It's about this little girl and all of the different people in her family who teach her. I'll read the first page and you read the rest. So really, that is giving the student who we're assessing with this running record, it's giving them a lot of scaffolds in terms of already telling them the main content and already reading them the first part of the pattern. And then to take that a step further, you'll notice in terms of the analysis of reading behaviors, teachers are asked to comment on, can the reader use the illustrations as a source of information? Can the reader carry the pattern from page to page? So looking at this, we're really not honing in on those essential early literacy skills. And in fact, this type of record is really leaning into that, again, that 3 cueing system that we know is not going to be meeting our students' needs. So we've got sort of the ideological issues with running records, but then also we can think about some more technical issues. And bear with me, I'm going to walk you through 2 studies and then give you a bit of a table. But I know for me, when I actually started reading some of the data about how running records might not be, the most effective tool, it was really fascinating for me, and it helped to make that quite straightforward. So this is a study that used the Fontes and Pinnell benchmark assessment system. And the students who participated in the study were in grade 2 and grade 3. And they were assessed twice, once with the Fontes and Pinnell benchmark assessment system, and then once with the oral reading fluency subtest of a CBM, a curriculum-based measure. And then these students were tested later on with an outcome measure. And the researchers focused on which of those 2 earlier assessments better predicted their future reading. And it was found that the benchmark assessment system, the Fontes and Pinnell, was 54% accurate in actually predicting future reading outcome, whether that child would be a strong proficient reader or whether they would be a weak reader. So about as effective as flipping a coin. And we can compare that to an 80% accuracy that the oral reading fluency subtest from a CBM had. So we know that, this type of assessment, while very commonplace, is maybe not necessarily the best and the most predictive option, so we know who is on track and who is at risk for future reading achievement. Now, part of the main, when we think about running records, a lot of the commentary about them is that they help give us a reading level. And it's worth unpacking that idea that a reading level may not necessarily be the most reliable construct. So in this study, which also focused on the benchmark assessment system, students were assessed to find their reading level, and then they were given text to read at that level. So if a child was a G, they were given books at a G to read. And it was actually found that when they were reading text at that instructional level that they were previously determined to be, only about a quarter of those students actually read those texts with sufficient accuracy, which makes us wonder, how reliable is that idea of a reading level? Does it give us the information we need to provide effective instruction? And is it reliable at all in and of itself? Along those same lines, this is a table from an article that Margaret Goldberg wrote. It's at Reading Rockets. It's a great article that I would highly recommend. And you'll notice that there is a table here where we've got the fiction option and the nonfiction option for, again, the benchmark assessment system books. And what is also provided here is the Lexile level, which is a different type of leveling system. Now, there's a lot to look at here and there's a lot to unpack, but I'll draw your attention to a couple of key points. First of all, there's a pretty significant amount of variability between different books that are said to be the same level. So if we look at that level F, we've got Anna's New Glasses, which has a Lexile level of 300. And then from Nest to Bird, which is considerably less challenging with a Lexile level of 210. And obviously, no leveling system is truly perfect. We're certainly not saying that Lexile is the gold standard, but it's worth recognizing that there's considerable variability between texts that are deemed to be at that same level. We can look within a level, but we can also look across levels as well. And that's important when we think about progress monitoring. We want to be able to monitor how are children doing and how are they responding to our instruction. If we look at those two options, the fiction options for level H and level K, you'll notice that those both have that same Lexile level, even though they are different F&P levels. Now, the challenge with this is if we're progress monitoring with a child, let's say this child is receiving reading intervention, do we know that this child actually has progressed? Or is it just that this child is reading two texts that are psychometrically quite similar? We don't know, and we don't have a reliable indicator of progress at this point. So if we go back to that idea of universal screening, right, we have those ideas of look fors in terms of what we're looking for when we're selecting a screener. We know we need it to be fast, reliable, and valid, indicators of those key skills that we know are important and predictive. Are running records fast? Well, I would say no, especially based on that idea that often we have to test up or down to find that reading level, and it can take a considerable amount of time depending on the child's needs. Are they reliable or valid? No. We know that there's high variability between the different text levels. We know that they are not as evidence-based as many of the curriculum-based measures out there. Are they indicators of essential early literacy skills? No. Think again to that link and that philosophical grounding in 3Qing, where students are, we're giving them patterned books and analyzing which cues they're using. And are they predictive? No. Think back to that paper that found that the benchmark assessment system was 54% predictive. Can we, with certainty, trust that data to allow us to predict who is going to be okay down the road so we can help them now? No, we can't, not with that tool. So that was our first big question that I wanted to dive into. And then also there is this sort of common question of, okay, you're saying we need to do universal screening 2 or 3 times a year with every child. Isn't this too much standardized testing? And that's a valid concern, and we'll start diving into that. So first of all, it's worth explaining what actually does that word standardized mean, because we use it a lot, but we use it incorrectly most of the time. When we're thinking of standardized simply refers to the way that a test or an assessment or a measure or any tool is given and then scored. So what that typically looks like for standardized is it means that it's delivered in the same way to everybody. So that means scripted directions, right? In terms of there is a clear set of instructions or directions that are read to the student, and oftentimes clear guidelines for scoring. Maybe there's a discontinue rule in terms of if there are this many errors, we stop here. It's worth stating that these commonly used assessments that are often used in classrooms, running records, these are standardized. These are standardized tests because there are specific directions and there are specific guidelines for scoring. We are already doing standardized assessments if we are using running records. So we need to clarify, what does that word standardized actually mean? And then we also have to clarify that important piece of, remember how fast screening is, right? Screening is supposed to be really quick. If we are doing it with everybody, and if we are trying to make sure that we are really maximizing our instructional time, we cannot be taking a whole pile of time to assess every single child. This is a slide I pulled from our first webinar. Please feel free to go back and take a look at that again, but you'll notice here, these are the time estimates for 2 commonly used CBMs, Acadience and Dibbles 8. You will notice that it varies based on the grade level and based on the point of time in the school year, but we are looking at less than 10 minutes per student. And at some grade levels, we're looking at 2 or 3 minutes. So I'm sure we'll hear from Kate later on in terms of how that timing worked for her. But thinking about that idea of doing a really brief screen 3 times per year, I would hazard a guess to say that if we sort of combined that up and thought about that across a school year, that's still a pretty brief screening as opposed to doing a running record or 2. So we've addressed why running records might not meet our screening needs and why we might not necessarily have to be too concerned about standardized testing. But a common comment and question is about sort of the origins of some of these CBMs, that they are American, and shouldn't we exercise caution when we think about using them with Canadian students? And that's a really important point to bring up, and there are absolutely considerations for that. First and foremost, I would point out that, again, many of those commonly used assessments are developed from American companies, and they are field tested with American students. I was reading the Fontes and Penal, the Benchmark Assessment System Technical Manual yesterday, and it lists all 5 of the states where the sample, the students and the schools in that sample came from. This is not something, these tools are not developed with Canadian students. It certainly is a consideration, it's something to be aware of, but it is a misconception to think that all of a sudden, by thinking about adopting DIBELS 8 or Acadience or Easy CBM, that we've got a new problem with it being an American source, because we've likely been using American tools all along. Now, this here, what I've provided here on this screen is, there's no data in it. I removed the data for privacy, but this is a screenshot of one of the data systems for one of these CBMs. And you'll notice that it gives us a goal, right? That's that idea of a benchmark goal, that criterion where we want to make sure that kids hit that, because if they hit that, they've got a pretty good chance of being strong readers down the road. But also we've got that option of local percentile. And that's a really important consideration when we think about how we're interpreting screening data. If it's something where, we have a measure that was maybe the benchmark was developed or field tested using data from an American sample, we also can interpret a student's score with respect to the local percentile, which is data from that local area. And what that area is really depends on what the measure is. But there are often options for a Canadian level interpretation within a tool's data system. And then lastly, a really common question and a really important question is focusing on culturally and linguistically diverse students in terms of, is this appropriate for them? How do we make sure that we are meeting their needs? And how do we make sure that we're not over or under identifying students who might be language learners or maybe culturally or linguistically diverse? And this was a very, 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 very important question. So, first and foremost, again, bear with me a little bit. In order to fully address this question, we have to take a little bit of a detour and chat about dynamic measurement. Now, you'll see that I've given a graph right there, and that is a graph from a student who I taught. And you'll notice that we have a series of data points that run all across the school year, right? Every time you see one of those, my pencil just ran away. Anytime you see one of those little data points, that is a 1-minute oral reading fluency prompt. So when we think about dynamic measurement, we think about brief measurement that is sensitive to change over time that we can do frequently. This comes from progress monitoring. This is not a universal screening measure, but it goes hand in hand with universal screeners. So when I think about this type of measurement, I have 20 different probes that I can use to monitor a child's response to instruction over time. So in this respect, I have a lot of flexibility, and that allows a pretty unique opportunity when we're thinking about children who are language learners or who might be culturally diverse as well, because it allows for much more flexibility in terms of measurement. And we're not focusing on a couple of snapshots that might not be reliable and might not fully incorporate the language and cultural knowledge that the child brings. So for example, with this dynamic measurement, we have the option to perhaps alternate how we're measuring or how we're progress monitoring. For example, if we think about even a child in French immersion, perhaps, who is receiving intervention and who is at risk, we could think about, for progress monitoring, alternating between English and French, so we get a more comprehensive and more holistic understanding of how that child's reading is progressing. We could look to something like a test, teach, and retest model, where we're not measuring what does a child know, we're measuring how are they responding to the instruction that we're giving them, and how can we best adjust our instruction to meet those needs. And you'll notice I've pulled a quote there where it really highlights the importance of, again, using this type of measurement to understand how do students respond to instruction. That way we are able to maximize and optimize the instruction, but that way we are also not reducing our likelihood of over or under identifying. Now, there are absolutely really important considerations when we're thinking about, especially working with language learners. And certainly there are plenty of wonderful resources out there. I have linked them in the Padlet where if this is a concern or if somebody is expressing concern to you, or if you're working with a population where there's a considerable amount of diversity, that is absolutely something to be aware of, and it has been well researched. Now, again, when we think about these tools that we're using, we really are focusing on evidence-based tools that have been evaluated with strong empirical research. So working with different populations of students, you'll notice I've given a screenshot here of a study evaluating Acadians reading and whether it is still a valid predictor of students who are English language learners. This is something where, there is research evaluating that because these are research-based tools. So it's certainly something to be aware of. It's not a void. There are people who are researching this. And then my last point with this is really, please check the Padlet. I have put lots and lots of resources. I've put a whole section on assessment screening, progress monitoring, and RTI for language learners or culturally and linguistically diverse students. So please take a look at that, because there are plenty of things for you to dive into if this is something that is relevant in your setting or in your population. So with that being said, I'm hoping that now you won't hear me talk quite as much because I've just done a whole lot of talking. And I would love to open it up to our wonderful group of teachers. And let's just start first and foremost. How did it go? The last time we saw these teachers in August, they were making plans for doing their universal screening in their classrooms. How did it go? Practically, logistically, what happened? How did it go? What did that look like? So I will pull us back. And then if we can, there we go. Okay. And Kate, since you are our kindergarten teacher, let's go chronologically. Can you start us out? How did screening go in your classroom? Give us an update.
Sure, it was fantastic. So I use Acadians, the free screener that's available online. They have tools that go from K to 6 for free screening tools. Just to recap from last time, if anybody wasn't here, that Acadians does have a pre-K, which would be the equivalent of our year 1 students. Called Pelly. It is one that you have to pay for. It's not one that I have access to right now. So I don't have something specifically for the year 1s, but their kindergarten level 1 is perfect for year 2. So a couple of weeks into the school year, I did screen all of my year 2 students. It went off without a hitch. I'm very lucky. Well, we're all very lucky in the Ontario kindergarten programs having a partnership in the classroom. I do take the lead on literacy in my room, but certainly early childhood educators are more than qualified to do any of this screening as well. But I was able to do mine when my partner had the kids either, at gym time or supervising playtime or that sort of thing. With the Acadians beginning of year, there's a 60-second, a 1-minute letter naming fluency subtask, and a 1-minute first sound of fluency. So letter naming is they're just looking at a sheet and pointing and naming as many of those letters as they can. We know that's a good predictive factor in terms of reading. And then with the first sound fluency, I say a word, they have to tell me the first sound. And let's say it's fog. If they say f, they get the 2 points, full score. If they say fa, they get 1 point, because there's a little bit of segmenting going on there, but it's not exactly just that first sound. 1 minute, 1 minute. So the entire thing was 2 minutes per child, plus of course a little bit of time to give some instructions. So absolutely worth those 2 minutes. And then with kindergarten, it's strictly you add the 2 numbers together to get a composite score. So later on, I know I'll get a little bit more into what that data looked like and what it told me, but 2 minutes per kid and got lots of great information. So it went really well.
Okay, well, that sounds, I'm so excited we'll go chronologically so we can see sort of how that screening changes as students get older and as we move through the grades. But it is something to be mindful of. There sometimes can be a concern about using this type of screening for young children. And it's worth reinforcing that idea that it's a brief little piece that oftentimes kids just think of as sound games, right? And it's reliable and valid for that age range. And it's frankly, when we think about the power of screening, when we think about early years, it's one of the most important parts in terms of we can get an idea of who's at risk and how the classroom instruction is moving and what that system looks like really early on, so we have enough time to do something about it. I will throw it over to you, Nellie, as our grade 2 teacher. How did screening go in grade 2?
So it also went really well. I will say that, just to back up, in grade 2 at the beginning of the year, because depending on the point and time in the year and depending on the grade, different measures are administered. So beginning of year grade 2, for every child, we do an oral reading fluency measure, which is where they read 3 texts timed at 1 minute each and then do an oral retell. And then in addition to that, there's a nonsense word reading assessment. And so, it didn't go entirely according to the plan that I spoke about in August. I will say, the reality of the classroom happened. And so the screening took longer than we had anticipated. And when I say we, I'm referring to myself and my partner. Realizing in hindsight that last year I did have a grade 2-3 class. So I think that the 3s helped to pull along the independence and the building of routines with the 2s. And so last year I was able to do a lot of the screening in class during class time. This year, I think that's been a little bit trickier. And so the screening did stretch out over more days than we had anticipated, as my partner and I tried to find the least disruptive times to cover, so that one of us could cover both classes, so that the other one could do all the screening. And our strategy was to do the oral reading fluency measures for all of the kids first, which took maybe 7 minutes per student, and then go back and do all the nonsense word reading measures for all the students, which was literally, a minute or so per child. And then we went ahead and compiled data and planned for instruction. So, yeah.
Okay. And then Lee, wrap us up. How did it go in grade 4?
So it went really well as well. As Nellie said, in the older grades, we do an oral reading fluency, or facilité en lecture orale. And so that's all I actually do in grade 4. So each of those measures is a 1 minute times the 3 texts. And then there is the retell component. And so they are expected to do a retell of key details and information. And you sort of rate that according to how much information is given, if it's given in a sequence. And so each of my students took a minimum of 3 minutes, because if they read less than a certain number of words correct per minute, you don't administer the retell, because they probably haven't read enough to actually garner enough information to actually give a retell. And so about 7 of my students would have taken me 3 minutes, because they did not read enough in to do that retell. And then the rest of them, I did a retell. So about 6 minutes for the second group of students, and about 3 minutes for the first group of students. And as Nellie mentioned, it didn't go exactly as planned. I'd have these grand ambitions of, today I'm going to get this big list of students done, and it would be maybe like 2/3 of that. I also wanted to wait enough to honor the fact that they hadn't probably spoken enough French over the summer, or read enough French to really give a true reflection of where they would be at the beginning of the year. And so I waited about a week and a half to start off my students that were maybe a little bit stronger, just to get them going. And then I waited on purpose to do some of the students that maybe needed a little bit more time, a little bit more language exposure again, and did them towards the end of my screening period. But all that, and I only have these students in the morning. It took me, I think, less than 9 days, and I missed a day here and there, so it was still quite rapid. Yeah, super great. And of course, this is what I'm still toting around, all my little booklets. These are what the booklets look like. So this is my whole class of information right here. So really easy to grab a booklet, my stopwatch, and go. And I will say that last year, when I did my first round of these in the spring, the retell was very stressful for me. Like, I was like, oh my gosh, like, did I get all the words? And when you rate the quality of the retail. But this year, I just felt so much more comfortable. Like I could count and I could actually keep track of the details. So you do certainly get better at these with practice, and you don't stress. Like if I've missed one word in the retail, it's probably not the end of the world because I have 3 to go on.
That actually is a really important point that as soon as I heard you talking, I said, oh my goodness, I should have included that as a question. How was that experience for you, knowing that all 3 of you, depending on your situation, some screened all through last year, some screened midway through. This is not your first crack at it. It's your students' first crack at it. So certainly I would imagine that we're thinking about building routine and an understanding of what that process looks like with students, but knowing that for the 3 of you, this is not news. And all 3 of you, again, have been trained on these measures. Would you say that it's something where you find that you're building confidence and maybe even speed for scoring and interpreting based on the fact that this is not your first crack at it?
100%. I mean, last year, a partner and I would administer it, and then a partner would be listening along and pretending she was doing something else and making notes. And we would get together and compare how we had done. But this year I felt completely comfortable with all aspects of it. I mean, I ironed out the bugs last year. So I think that one administration sort of helps you work out and ask questions. I mean, Nellie and Uno, you both get texts from me quite, frequently where we ask, what do I do with this? So you sort of work out those as you encounter them, but far more comfortable. And I see people asking actually in the chat, and I completely forgot to mention this. In French, we use a French version of Acadience. It's called Idapel. And so it is a CBM as well. However, it is in French.
And then Lee, just to clarify, you mentioned those booklets. Those booklets you will use straight through the year, right? So those booklets contain all your probes for beginning, for mid, for, end for. If you were thinking of progress monitoring, which maybe we'll talk about in our November session, but if you were thinking about progress monitoring, you would have a separate booklet, knowing that would be, many more 1-minute probes for students who are receiving intervention or support. But that booklet stays with the child for the whole school year. Nellie, it looked like, sorry, I cut you off. What were you were going to jump in?
No, I was just going to jump in and add to something that Lee said that I had forgot to mention. So Lee made a really good point about, I wanted to say that we started the screening the 2nd week of school and thinking potentially next year about starting the 3rd week once they've, depending on the group, depending on the grade level, once they've had an even, a bit of a longer stretch to get back into the swing of things, and they are rusty, especially with the additional language after the summer, and just thinking about taking all of those factors into consideration, wondering if the overall time that it took to screen might have been shortened had we done it 1 week later. So I just wanted to add to that.
Okay, I think I will jump into, hang on, let me pull you back and oops, there we go. Okay, so question 1, we've got a bit of an update. How did it go? Let's talk about the good one, the one that I'm most excited about. What did you notice about your students' reading? What were your big findings? What came out of this screening? We've talked a lot about how we need to screen. We need to screen with all early readers. We need to make sure we're targeting our screening onto those key essential literacy skills that are most appropriate at different age windows. Again, recognizing that the skills that Kate is tapping are different than the skills that Nellie is tapping, which are different than what Lee is tapping in grade 4. What came out of this? What have you learned about your students' reading? So I will pull us back again. And Nellie, catch us up. What did you find?
Okay, well, I found that, there are the data shows that there are a range of needs and a range of skill levels, from many students being below or well below benchmark to a couple being above. And so really, I just thought that I would hone in on 2 big findings that really jumped out at me. So first, I wanted to talk about fluency. So when you do an oral reading fluency measure, the 2 data points that come out are a measure of their fluency, which is their words correct per minute, and then their accuracy percentage, which is really a measure of more advanced, their ability to identify more advanced phonics patterns and decode those in words in a connected text. So What's interesting and what I think without this data would otherwise go unnoticed, and many students can fall through the cracks and appear to be reading at a fairly appropriate level. When you look at their words correct per minute, some of them are in the green range, which means they're at benchmark. But then when you look at their accuracy percentage, it's well below. And then when you look even more closely at their score on their the nonsense word reading measure, it's clear that they have gaps in that foundational piece in terms of their basic phonics knowledge. And so just the nonsense word reading measure is identifying basic letter sound correspondences and their ability to blend those together automatically to read words that are invented so that they don't have, they're not able to refer to a word that they already know in their oral vocabulary, or that maybe they've memorized because they've seen it previously in print. And so what I really notice is that those foundational skills are obviously weak. And that would not necessarily come through if I hadn't done the universal screening. So the ones who appear to be reading fluently, but when you dig a little deeper, are actually not, because they don't have those accuracy skills in place. And then the other big finding for me was the number of students that have difficulty with the oral retell. And so, of course, that there's a number of factors at play there. Obviously, we know that 100%, if their accuracy is weak and their fluency is weak, that's not going to support comprehension of text. But also thinking about the other strand of Scarborough's reading rope, their oral language abilities and the extent of their vocabulary, that just helped me realize and really helps me target instruction in terms of, yes, accuracy for sure, which is what we're going to work on, but then at the same time, that explicit instruction in vocabulary, especially as they're learning an additional language, and then, multiple ongoing opportunities to speak, as well as reading aloud to them those rich texts so that they're building a vocabulary, so that when they are able to crack the code and read it for themselves, they have the comprehension of what the words that they're lifting off the page mean. So, yeah.
You have so much analysis from that. It kind of blows me away in terms of how you've got, I think from when I know when I work with students that I find that NWF to be really illuminating, because it really cuts down to what exactly are those decoding skills like, knowing that, especially I think about Nellie, you as grade 2, and then I think about what that profile looks like when they reach a teacher like Lee in grade 4, where if they're, sort of eking their way through a passage, relying on context, relying on vocabulary, if they're sort of, scrambling through, those compensatory strategies, the wheels start to fall off the bus once they get into junior, when they're reading across multiple content areas and they don't have that those oral language and vocabulary skills to support them. So thank you for that analysis. And I 100% agree that the NWF is often a real eye-opener that really does inform instruction, which we're going to talk about next. Lee, catch me up. What were the big findings from your class this year?
Okay, so I'm hoping I can read. I mean, I've been adding notes, and so this is just, you can't really see, but it's a big pile of chicken scratch that I want to try to cover everything. And so just to protect my kiddos' privacy, I'm going to hold this back, but you can see just that the colors. And so this second column, this is accuracy, and this is their words correct per minute, so the rate. And so no surprises, there's a lot of room for growth. And I'll have to admit that initially when I saw this and when I did this, I felt quite overwhelmed. And then I thought back to a few years ago when I would have had, similar data from maybe different measures and maybe not as tight information. I would have felt overwhelmed as well. But this year I started to feel less overwhelmed because I thought I have a plan, right? I actually can do something with this. And so we've put a fair bit of information to use now. And so I think, you're going to talk about this, but I found that about 40% of my students are at grade level, which means that 60% aren't. And so when we see that 60% number, that sort of tells us that we want to do a lot of whole class stuff. And so I've really focused on my tier 1 instruction. So we do a lot of stuff as a whole class. And so that's what I really learned, was that there's a lot of need for accuracy and fluency, because as you can see, those things, for the most part, for my kiddos lined up quite well. I discovered that I have a sort of a big need across the board within my class. And so that was the first thing that I noticed. I noticed that about a third of my students are what I would consider to be red. And so here's the thing with grade 4 French immersion, there aren't set benchmarks yet. Those are still being created. And so I had to create my own norms, sort of, except that I used things that we would know. So we know that accuracy is incredibly important if we're to make meaning from text. And so my accuracy cut point for green is 90%, which is probably actually a little bit lower maybe than we would want it to be, but I just chose the number of 90%. So, 9 out of my 24 kiddos are reading at an accuracy of about 90 or above percent. So there's a lot of need in my class. I also found that I needed to do a little bit more of a dive into some of my kiddos after doing this. And so with some of my students, I knew that I needed to look more closely at where they were with sound and letter correspondences. And so I've done that based on this, but I wouldn't have necessarily known what to do first and next if I hadn't had this information.
I think that's a really important point that reminds me of something to address in our next webinar, that idea of diagnostic assessment. That piece, we know that screening is short and brief with everybody, and I'm sure we'll chat a little bit more maybe in the next question in terms of how this informs instruction. But we think about that idea of diagnostic assessment being that something we do a little bit just with students who we still have questions about or who we don't know what to teach next. It's not something we would do with everybody, knowing that it's quite a lengthy process. When we think about diagnostic assessment, that would be something like a decoding survey or a phonemic awareness inventory, where we're assessing, okay, what exact letter sounds does a child have? That's not necessarily something we would do with everybody, because again, we want to maximize and optimize that instructional time. I will round this out with Kate. I'm so curious to hear about your kindergartners. How did it go? What did you find?
So I'm excited to share what we learned. Una, would you mind showing that slide? It has my little chart on it. So I rewrote my data so that it's not alphabetical. Of course, we want to maintain privacy of our students, but I just thought it'd be interesting to give you a little peek at just what the little tracking sheet looks like. So letter naming fluency, so that's how many they named in the 1 minute. For sound fluency, how many points they scored in the minute. And then the composite total is when you add the two together. So green means at benchmark or above benchmark. And if you look down at the bottom, I put in what the benchmark was. So there's no benchmark for letter naming fluency, but for first sound fluency, the benchmark is 10. So if you're a 10 or above, you're at benchmark, but then above benchmark is 16 and up. So you can see that those scores, those green scores are quite high. The composite, again, 26 for benchmark, 38 would be above benchmark. So again, high. So what this data told me, first of all, is that structured literacy works, because the majority of these kids were in our structured literacy program last year. So that's good news, and to tell us that we're on the right track. Also, we see clearly that there's one student that is struggling or was struggling at that time with first sound fluency. So certainly that was a goal to target. And it's important to look at that because there's no benchmark for letter naming fluency. There's one student where you can see they named 5 letters in that minute. So their first sound fluency score was high enough that the composite is even in the green zone. So you could look quickly and just think, oh, well, that student's fine. But the fact that they only could name 5 letters in the minute was obviously something that, even though it didn't come out red, was a little bit of a red flag to me. So something to look at. And so, and you mentioned diagnostics. So I also wanted to mention that is something I did because there's only 10 of them. I did do a letter name and a letter sound for lowercase and uppercase, complete with all 10 of them, just to see where they were and where the gaps were. And, in the final question, I can talk a little bit about what I did with that data too. But so the screening data sort of got me started. And then I wanted a little bit more information just to be sure of where I was going and how I was going to do groups and who was going to need some extra support and that sort of thing. But yeah, that's how the data turned out there, and it's just so valuable. And I was excited to get working with it.
I can believe it. And I just will jump in just to your point about there, at least in the tool that you use, not being a benchmark for the letter naming fluency. That's a common question in terms of why do we have a benchmark for this, and this, but why do we not have a benchmark for letter naming fluency? When we're saying benchmark, we mean that cut score that we want to be able to say, okay, if a child is meeting this, we have a pretty good chance of them being okay in the future. And at least for the measure you're using, Kate, the rationale for that is that we want benchmarks for essential early literacy skills. When we think about that, we think about those skills where if we teach them, if we do something about it, we know that there's a causal relation to improve student outcomes. The letter naming fluency subtest, at least in Acadian, serves to be an indicator of risk in terms of if a child is having difficulty with it, we know we can interpret that along with other sources of data. Remember, this is not the only piece of information about students. We're constantly, interpreting this in relation to other classroom observations and other assessment, but that letter naming fluency is an indicator of risk, but it's not necessarily something where we want to teach letter naming fluency, where we're having kids practice letters quickly. We know that's not an essential early literacy skill, but just a predictor. So it gives additional insight for teachers in terms of judging risk. And I will, just before we just get into our third question, just a little bit more from me, my apologies, I know I'm chatting a lot, but I think it's important to clarify that when we think about screening data, we can use those data to get an indicator of which individual students are at risk. That's really often what pops up onto us in terms of, oh my goodness, I'm concerned about this child, this child, this child. But it's really important to think about pulling back and thinking about that idea that a really important second purpose of this tool is for us to analyze the risk of the entire system. So we can think about the individual student, but then we can also think about the system, the classroom, the school, the grade level, whatever that system level is. So when we think about classroom level analysis, a really important tool that I'd be curious to hear if any of the three of you used is there are grouping worksheets available. So this is one that is for Acadians. There are ones for DIBELS 8. It allows teachers to quickly and effectively sort of summarize that key data and get a sense of, okay, what does my class look like? What percentage of students are at benchmark for this particular skill? We want that classroom level analysis to understand, is this something that should be worked on with individual students? Is this skill something that should be worked on with this one small group? Or is this something where we've got so many students who are struggling with it that really everybody needs it? So we want to make sure that that is whole group. So this type of grouping worksheet, which I have linked in the Padlet, so please check the Padlet. They are all here. Links to them are all there. But this allows us, there we go. I forgot that I had it removed. This allows us to understand how healthy our tier 1 instruction is. And sort of the rule of thumb is we want to see about 80% of students meeting the benchmark with tier 1 instruction. We know that it's very tempting to think about problem solving for individual students. But the challenge is if we have so many students who are needing support, we can't possibly meet those needs with individual extra support. So in that response, we really want to think about how can we maximize our core tier 1 instruction, still differentiated. We're not saying that it is, just whole group and everybody gets the same thing, but how do we really, really, really make sure that we're optimizing our tier 1 to support the greatest number of students? And there are there are tools that can be used to give rough estimates about how to build small groups based on screening data that we've linked to as well. And then, I jumped ahead one. I'm hoping that some of our teachers will chat a little bit about class-wide intervention, knowing that class-wide intervention is a really important tool when we're thinking about patterns across a class where it's a common skill that needs instruction for many students. And that idea of using that screening data to really maximize teacher time and mindfully and minimally using centers or stations, knowing, as Tim Shanahan mentions, that it really is time with the teacher receiving direct instruction that best supports their outcomes. So I want to make sure I'm leaving enough time for all of you to tell us about your instructional plans, and also I see the Q&A keep on going and going. So I'll be quiet now, and I'll start with Lee. Tell me about what are your plans? How will you use your screening data to support your instruction? What do you think that will look like? Whole group, small group? Just give me a rough outline and I'll pull us back.
Sure. So I recognized, as we've mentioned before, that there was a big need for that solid core tier one instruction. And so a lot of my program is implemented with the whole class. And so with my grade 4 class, we do a phonemic awareness that we connect to our sound wall. We do that nearly every day. We do an explicit phonics lesson nearly every day as well. And it's been quite neat to see the kids start to use those tools. So again, connecting to our sound wall. And so when they're encoding, it was so cool to see this. A child was trying to spell out pousser, but he'd written PU. And then I could see the eyeballs go to the sound wall. And so just that, me making an example of when I'm trying to sound things out and I go to the sound wall and I compare sounds that might be similar, like E and Oo, them using those tools independently. So we do that whole class, and I'm really starting to see that in individual students has been amazing to see. Let's see, we do a keyword use. So every day we use a code pack. And so every student will with me, and we make a point of everyone saying, sit up, we're doing our attentive listening, like my brain is turned on. And so we really make sure that this is not daydreaming time. This is active thinking time. And then we practice a dictation. And the one thing I recently learned from Anita Archer, and I feel like I'm going to mention her twice, is increased opportunities to respond. And so when I'm asking questions or when I'm asking for a sound, because I've shown a grapheme, I ask it of the whole class. So I don't ask individual students, we all call it out. And so I think she says, less hands up and everybody does everything. And so we really do honor that with whole class. So everyone has a lot of opportunities to interact and respond. Another Anita Archer is that you mentioned this, Nellie, like they really need that vocab. And so I've recognized that part of their struggles when they're decoding are related to them not necessarily knowing what those words are. In English, when we decode, we can often get close to the word and we're like, oh, I know that word. That doesn't happen as easily in French. And so we're doing a lot of very explicit vocab instruction. And I feel, again, very Anita Archerish because I get them to say it multiple times back. I'll put it in a sentence like when we're turning on the lights, like, or turning them off, like allumer les lumières. And so I'm like, on fait quoi? And they're like, allumer. And so we say it back and forth and we have actions. And so we do a lot of repetition of new vocab. And so that's been wonderful. Thank you to Lindsay Kemeny and Dr. Matt Burns, who introduced the concept of daily partner reading. And so that has become a non-negotiable to us. And so in order to work on fluency, my green and yellow groups together will do partner reading every day for 12 minutes. And in the spirit of repeated reading, we know that kids benefit from reading things 2 to 3 to 4 times. They have 2 or 3 or 4 texts to read throughout the week, and they will read the same thing over and over if that's what they choose to do. And during that time, I grab my kiddos that need that intensive support, and I work with them again on some of the same skills. We might repeat exposures to our code pack. We practice encoding again, just really those key foundational skills that we see that they need. And it's been incredible to see the growth in that short period of time, but also their incredible attitudes. I mean, they are in it to win it, and they really want to get this done. Let's see. Oh, yes. And then finally, you mentioned earlier, Una, progress monitoring. And so that's something I need to investigate because I know that those sorts of things are available in Acadians. I actually don't know if there's oral reading fluency progress monitoring for some of the older grades. I see Nellie indicating. So I'm hoping there are, because I'm ready to do some progress monitoring to see if what we've been doing with our instruction is working.
Maybe we'll just have to talk a lot more about progress monitoring in November then. Maybe that'll be our topic. Okay, thank you, Lee. And I'm going to jump over to Kate. Tell me about what the plans are for kindergarten based on your data.
Okay, so I mentioned that I also did a little bit of diagnostics. So I did want to see what letters the kids knew and what sounds they knew. And Una, you said it perfectly. The idea is not to train kids for the letter naming fluency, that we're trying to get them faster and faster at that for the purposes of that test. But we do know that knowing their sounds and their letters is something certainly that's important. And actually mid-year for Acadians, they'll be asked to do 2 new tasks. So they'll be doing phoneme segmentation fluency, where they'll be breaking down a whole word. And then they'll also be doing nonsense word fluency, where that decoding piece starts to come in. So we're trying to get a good start on that as well. So for For several of the kids, there were just a handful of letters or sounds they didn't know. And if that was the case, I just did the Lindex cards. I did an envelope. I sent them home and asked families to help them practice. Often it was just like the B and D lowercase mixed up, or maybe the sound of Q, or it's just some of those things that they wouldn't see as often. And then the 3 that need more work on that, we're doing a bit of small groups. One thing I've done is I've taken embedded mnemonics and just made a little matching game so that they can sit and use that to help. It's kind of a scaffold to help reinforce those sounds. So that's one thing that they do. One thing that I noticed from the data is I didn't really see need to change tier 1 instruction. So I'm using the UFly Foundation Phonics program this year, which is amazing. So everybody gets that tier 1 in the first place. The kids who are reading well occasionally get to, come and read their decodable books to me or do partner reading, that sort of thing. For the student who was in the red zone with with first sound fluency, that was certainly something that we wanted to work on. So I used a couple of tools. For example, we have this neat match a sound kit. And so I would just take a student one-on-one, or occasionally if they wanted a friend, to just kind of make it social. And, there's just little plate or pads and little objects. And so this one's the fire. And so they have to find the other things that start with like the feather and match them all up. So again, it's not a reading or writing piece. It's just strictly that kind of first sound, but using some manipulatives. So working on that. And in terms of the progress monitoring piece, I'm very happy to say that after only a few weeks, that child went from a score of 0 to a score of 22, which is now in the above benchmark category. So it's just another example of how that small group or one-on-one intervention works. And that's not something that we had to drag out all year long. It's just, you can work on them, get them where they need to be, and then hope that they're going to just continue on that way, right? So that little red bar didn't mean, oh my gosh, that child has dyslexia. Oh my gosh, we need to bring the resource teacher in and we need to do all this fancy testing and it's going to cost all this money. It was just a little bit of time and I needed that data, right? So I just found that so valuable. And I just wanted to say, to wrap up, is as much as I'm a literacy person, the whole science and math and data aspects of the screening, I just find incredible. I can say 100% that using Acadians, it wouldn't have to be that brand necessarily, but using an appropriate universal screener has made a huge difference in my teaching. It's made me a better teacher, a more effective, a more efficient teacher, and has definitely led to higher student achievement. So in case anybody couldn't tell from this series so far, I am all for the universal screening, and it's a great thing for kids. It's something that we want as teachers. We want proper training. We want time to do it. Absolutely. But it is something that we want.
And there's so many things I want to pull out of your response there, but in the interest of time, so we can make sure we address some of the many, many questions that are popping up, there are 2 main points that I think are worth emphasizing and showcasing there. Number one, the incredible value of having universal screening, knowing how much easier it is to provide that initial little bit of support with a 5-year-old versus having a grade 5 student, right? Recognizing, Kate, that your movement from well below benchmark to meeting that benchmark is a much, much, much smaller ask than thinking about an older student. And then the other important piece that I wanted to just bring to the front again is that idea that we're not screening to identify a learning disability or to say this child has dyslexia. We're screening to inform our instruction, because that is what allows us to provide that best possible support to meet students' need and to have that optimal match. So I just wanted to echo that out again and amplify that. We are not screening for identifying of a learning disability. That's not what screening is. Screening is to assess risk and to inform instruction. And I will pass that on to Nellie to wrap us up before we have some time for some of the wonderful questions that are popping in.
Okay, I will try to be quick and I will not go through all my notes. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things and speak really quickly. So forgive me. So yeah, in terms of compiling the data, and then really the first step was to decide, do I need to teach whole group? What do I need to teach whole group? And yes, 100%. That tier 1 whole class instruction is happening and needs to happen based on the results of my data. And Una, those grouping worksheets that follow the Acadians outcomes driven model that are linked in the Padlet were super helpful to me. So I highly recommend those. And so the tier 1 or core classroom whole group instruction looks like it, I'm following a structured literacy model. And we're working on, sequentially building phonics skills as well as explicit phonemic awareness skills, because we know that's a huge underpinning of proficient reading. And then linking phonemic awareness skills to print. We're doing a balance of decoding and encoding. So they're blending and they're segmenting. Segmenting is hugely it's really important for their future, for them to be able to spell effectively, and then practice with decodable text while building in that corrective feedback. And Anita Archer is a god. And yes, we learn a lot from her, what Lee said, and those opportunities to respond chorally and frequently have been huge game changers. And so then there's a handful of students that I'm going to dig a little deeper with by doing a phonics diagnostic so that I can really hone in and target the instruction exactly to what phonics patterns they're missing and what syllable patterns they are able or not able to decode yet, as well as a phonemic awareness survey just to get some more information about their ability to work with oral speech sounds. And I just want to say this whole process has really helped me rethink small group instruction. So I find, typically we're kind of programmed, or I was programmed to think, okay, I have this data, reading levels, and every kid belongs in a group. So I'm going to put every student in a group now. And every student doesn't need to be in a group, because if I'm delivering whole class instruction, then that would not be the best use of my time to be redelivering the same instruction 5 times to 5 different groups, for example. So I'm going to take in a small group the kiddos that I am most concerned about, that really need an extra dose in addition to that whole class instruction. And then my students, couple of students that are above benchmark, that are really ready, they've cracked the code, they're ready to work on more advanced phonics patterns, morphology, and who can read more widely. And then we're going to talk more about the progress monitoring next time, but really there are measures, there are 20 probes for nonsense word reading. And so I'm hoping to do that to keep my finger on the pulse of how they're responding to the instruction so that those groups can change flexibly over time. That's it, I'm done. Sorry.
Well, we're going to come back to that NWF in November, then I'm going to make a note for that. Joanne and Alicia, do you want to jump in with a couple of questions if we're at that time?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks. That was amazing. And you guys are so just amazing to listen to. I was just sitting here the entire time enthralled. So thank you all for that. So we did have a lot of questions, a lot of really excellent questions, and unfortunately, we're not going to have time to get to all of them. But we have recorded all of the questions, and we will go back and we will answer the ones that we are unable to get to tonight in a document that we will send out, or we'll put it up on the Padlet. That's what we'll do. But I am going to ask a couple. So we had quite a few questions about kindergarten and the appropriateness of screening children in kindergarten. So 2 things that came up. Was something from the last webinar. Somebody asked, was it not stated during the last session that Acadians was not appropriate for kindergarten? And then I'm just going to add the second one in there because it's kind of similar about it's for the Acadian screener. Do the year 2 kindergarten students have to be 5 years old? We use DIBELS and the benchmarks are based on students being 5 years old. So it's about that age appropriateness of the screeners in kindergarten. And so I will turn that over to whoever wants to answer. Thank you.
I don't mind starting. And Kate, if you have any practical insight, please jump in. First and foremost, I think there is a bit of confusion with the name Acadians. Acadians is the company, but there are several different measures underneath that. Keeping in mind, Acadians is the new name for DIBELS, which adds a whole other can of worms with the names, and it's very confusing. But Acadians has a core set of measures, K6, which would be our senior kindergarten or our year 2 of kindergarten to grade 6. That I think is what that initial question was responding to. That idea that, and Kate can speak to this, but she was using Acadians K6 with her year 2s. There is a separate assessment called, which is it's called preschool, knowing that in the US, their preschool would be our year 1 of kindergarten. It's called the Preschool Early Literacy Indicators, which can be used with 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, so it could be used before JK. I don't want to speak specifically to DIBELS 8 because I'm not trained in it, but typically it does not, at least based on my understanding, typically it goes based on grade level and not by age. So I would be inclined to say, even if a child, and again, I say that with a measure that I'm not trained on, but I would be inclined to say if a child was in SK, that it would still be appropriate to deliver the K, even if they weren't yet 5. Kate, does that sound about what you think?
Yep. I don't have anything else to add. No, Una, I think you got it there.
All right. We have another question about IDAPAL and French. Some people believe in their experience with IDAPAL that it's very difficult. And if you're testing at grade 2, the IDAPAL level grade 2 is very difficult. And the question is would it be ethical to offer grade 1 or kindergarten level IDAPAL to students in grade 2, for example?
French pals, do you want me to start with that and you can fill in? So I think there are a couple things that I think to me come to mind. And again, I'm not an EDAPL user, but I am an Acadience English user. I think often we're conditioned to think about how we would think about accuracy levels within a running record, where we're really thinking about that 90 to 95 or 95 to 100. We're thinking about independent frustration levels. That's not necessarily the case for this type of assessment, because remember, those benchmarks, those numbers are derived from research. So where those come from is students are longitudinally followed, and those kids who end up being strong readers down the road, we can look back and say, how did they score at this point in time? And that allows us to not us, it's not me, but that allows these really brilliant researchers to develop a benchmark score to say, we want kids to hit this point. So it's not necessarily something where and again, that depends on the benchmark, but certainly thinking, I know from my experience, the grade 1 Acadience English, it's a challenging passage, but we're not expecting 95 or 97% accuracy. So it's worth being mindful of what that benchmark actually is. The other piece is there is the opportunity for survey assessment, or for survey level assessment. We always want to screen at grade level, even if we know a child is having difficulty. There are discontinue rules. So if it's an absolute disaster, the child won't have to slog through something that's really painful and difficult for them. So we're not torturing children by any stretch. There is a discontinue rule, but we do need to have that grade level screening data, because it allows us, I think we're often thinking about the individual student. It allows us to have that systems level analysis in terms of who's having difficulty. If we're thinking about progress monitoring, though, we would want to progress monitor at the measure and at the level that is the instructional goal for that child. So if we think about that grade 2 level student, and if they're having significant difficulty, then yes, we could do our screening with grade 2 and then go back and find where are we progress monitoring, because that is the measure that's going to be most sensitive to growth. We don't want to measure the temperature outside with a thermometer that starts at 40 degrees, right? Because we're not going to actually see growth. That would be how I would respond to that. But Lee or Nellie, feel free to jump in, especially Nellie as a grade 2 French teacher.
I think you covered most of it. I would just add that a couple of the details. Yes, in my experience, when I first looked at those texts last year, I thought, there's no way my kids can read this. Like, they're all going to be well below benchmark. But two things to keep in mind. One is that they're not expected to read that entire passage in 1 minute. And the other thing that was an aha for me is that the level of difficulty from the beginning of the year measures to middle of year to end of year measures, the level of difficulty of the passages does not increase. What increases or changes is the benchmark. Is there anything I should add to that, Una?
I don't think so. I think that is great.
So to continue along with IDAPL, a teacher says, I'd love to know Nellie and Lee's opinion in terms of what age grade is best to use IDAPL with FL students, and when it's best to use Acadience so that French language doesn't interfere with the skill we are assessing.
Sure, I'd be happy to address that one. And I think Nancy Wise has done some work on this as well. We do, our kindergarten begins, our French immersion begins in grade 1. And so it wouldn't be appropriate at the beginning of the year to tackle an EDAPL measure. I mean, they just wouldn't have the skills with that. And so we did we did an English assessment. It wasn't a screen, but it was an English assessment that gave us information about their first language skills. For example, are they able to blend and segment in their first language? And so the first one, depending on when they begin their second language instruction, I think you would want it to be in English. And then midway through the year, middle year, end of year is when you would consider bringing in that, possibly even both, quite honestly. Mid-year, you could do both if you really have some wonderings. But as they gain that knowledge in that language, mid-year, end of year.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we have a question about older students. Did you find that the screener was able to give you enough information to inform their needs if your students are in grade 3 or grade 4?
Do you want to start with that, Lee?
Yeah, I've done that. I did Dibbles last year with my English. I taught last year both in English and in French. And so I used Dibbles beginning, middle, and end of year. And so one thing I really like about both of these CBMs is they give incredible checklists on reading behaviors. And so, for example, when they add or drop sounds frequently. And so it really gives you sort of an overall look at their reading behaviors. And so when they're making mistakes, do they make mistakes that change the sense of the text versus keep the sense of the text? So absolutely, I found that incredibly helpful at the grade 4 level. And the other thing was the rappel, or the retell piece. It showed me, as you noticed, Nellie, that's a skill that certainly is sort of next level, that ability to recall and to sequence information. And so from having done that last year, I discovered another fabulous whole class intervention called paragraph shrinking. And so I implemented that as a result of the information that I got from doing this, in that I noticed there was definitely a need in their retell. And so it helped me incredibly at grade 4, pardon me.
And if I could, can I jump in with like 10 seconds? I think we also, again, want to think about, there is that opportunity for survey level if we're looking at if we're wanting to find a progress monitoring level. And then also, we can also think about adding in diagnostic assessments. Screening, again, think about it as a thermometer. If you're going to the doctor and if you run a fever, they're still going to be digging deeper into if there's a problem, right? So we're not expecting this to be the only source of information, especially for students who are really struggling. There are other pieces that come into it that we use to inform instruction, but we need to know there's a problem first, and that's what the screening does. That rings the alarm bell, and then that might be enough, or we might need to dig in.
Good. Right. Thank you very much. Before we go on, we do have Patricia de Geer with us. She's the head commissioner of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and she'd like to greet everyone who's attending this evening and share a word with us. Thank you so much for being here, Patricia. Would you like to take the floor?
Right. Can you see me?
Not yet.
I can tell you that you can hear me, though.
Very well. Yeah.
You can hear me.
Yes.
A jolly good evening, everyone. I am really thrilled to be in this space with you. I must tell you, though, that we are going through an IT migration at our workplace, and for whatever reason, they have taken off the ability to see me. And I don't think it's personal or a bad thing, but we're that in the stage. And you know what? It jolly well could be me. I'm not a Luddite. I'm just an IT peasant. So I still cannot put myself in the space to do that. But aside from that, I have listened to you as you imparted or you shared your knowledge and your passion about this. And it's contagious. It really is contagious. I got a shot in my arm at Spring Waters when I spoke to the dyslexia group on Dyslexia Day. And believe me, I'm still existing off of that. So if I sound passionate tonight or extra passionate, Uma Malcolm has seen me before, and also Alicia. So if I sound extra passionate, that is the carryover from that event. And I do apologize again for not having an image. I should be talking to my IT guy about that. But I just want to say that I am just blown away by the sheer numbers of educators in the province who are taking this interest in the learning to read, and for early students, and also about the right to read. And I don't want to put the right to read in the center to seem selfish, but I know that it is the blueprint from which the EDU MOE is working from. And so I recognize it. But tonight, I just want to say a few words about the importance of early screening. And when I came in, I heard Uma and someone else speaking. And one of the things that hit me was the concept of universal screening. And I think I'm not in your lane. Far beyond. No, I'm not even in your lane at all with respect to this. But when I hear about things that I self-educate about, when I had my struggles as a mother back in the 90s, dealing with whole language and phonics, that I took it upon myself to import tapes from the United States and on phonics, and used to share it with parents. And I probably shared this before, this little ditty we would sing, I'm stuck on phonics, and phonics stuck on me. And that was just so very important. And I want to leave from that to say that phonics and early screening are not medical assessments. And I'm sure everyone has heard that. They are measures to inform the students in how to instruct their children. It's not a medical assessment to say whether the person has a learning disability. And it's a quick and informal evidence-based test that provides information about possible reading difficulties. And sometimes, perhaps in my own personal experience teaching family members, is that you can also hear whether they are pronouncing the proper, giving the proper pronunciation to certain letters, because as we know that letters have different sounds in different situations. You may find yourself working with a digraph or trigraph or diphthongs and whatever have you, and you have to take children to those places. But I'm sure Oma and I think it's Kate, you've done an excellent job, because I heard part of it saying that screening is not a diagnosis, and it does not identify children for special education designation or a label. And there is a concern that I had from my many meetings with EDU, that, and I don't know whether this is true, and the teachers are concerned that if they use the screening processes and they do it twice a year, it could be a label on the teachers. And I say, how could that be when teachers are demonstrating by screening their interest in the child and their preference for catching it early? In business, we talk about key and objectives and key results, and we talk about KPIs. This is basically your KPI in this space, to see how children are progressing by returning to the most evidence-based and impactful way of teaching. And so I'm very pleased that Una and Alicia and your friends, I don't see the names, but I've heard you, that you are taking on this responsibility to help students to receive immediate and targeted support. And I'm going to tell you where my inspiration comes from. As a mother, as an aunt, as a grandmother, as a they call me grand mentor and great grand mentor. I see the most fascinating thing is to assist children in progressing in their lives. And I cannot understand or know anything that is more impactful for children than in the early ages to teaching them to learn to read early, whether they have a disability or not. Because reading is so fundamental. And I say to people, my father used to say, if you can't read, you're a nobody. And it's the whole structure on which one's life begins. You learn to read, you're able to go on and do better in the upper grades. If you do not have that foundation of early reading, and you know what, I'm preaching to the choir, maybe to the pastors saying this, but I just want to tell you that at the Ontario Human Rights Commission, we are so committed about this process that I can sometimes I feel I was saying to Keith Gray the other day, the founder of the IDA, that I feel them days like taking a public podium and a blowhorn and start speaking about this, that the children have a right to read. It is their future. We have to help them shape their future. And it is probably one of the most impactful things that we can do. And what it does when you begin from this very basic level, it gives schools the opportunity to make informed data in decisions because they can compare results from common screening tools across the population. And so teachers can play a critical role in assessing students and identifying their learning needs. And I think I heard Uma saying as I came on that it's not it gives you an early opportunity to intervene. And when you have that early intervention, I think the teachers benefit, although the students benefit more. Because what you're doing is helping the child to move on and making your life easy by using an evidence-based tool to assist that child. And I've got to tell you, teachers, I come from a family of teachers. I actually was sent to teacher training school and decided I'm not going to teach at the end of the day. I decided to do law. And, you know, but my passion for teaching is still there. And I cannot accept that there is any other profession that is more noble and more important than the teachers. Yeah, you can be a great doctor and you could be a great lawyer, you could become a great judge, but if you do not have those foundational skills, you can't get there. So in my view, you have the most important job. Sometimes I wonder why they pay you so little, given the fact that you are the root cause of making these great scientists and whatever have you. And I go back to the point of, again, on screening. It identifies children who are at risk, young readers who are behind on foundational reading skills, and prevent them from developing later reading difficulties and dealing with associated lifelong consequences and failing to learn to read. And that is why early screening is critical for children to catch up. And right now, the minister is announcing assistance for catching up. And I see him from time to time, and I told him that I think that this is the best form of catching up ever that we are doing. We have to invest in our children. It is their future. And if I may be a tad selfish, it also gives us a little assurance about who's going to pay for our pensions, right? So if we can do that a bit. And so school must screen every student, starting in kindergarten year 1, using evidence-based screening tools. And I keep stressing that. During the inquiry, one of the things they found out is that teachers with their passion to help children, they would go out and spend their money to make sure that children are on comparative with their own other students in reading abilities. And so they would do that. But what happens with that is that some teachers were sailing east, others sailing west, north or south. There was no consistency. And again, I heard Uma and a group talking about universal screening, and consistency is so important, whether no matter what language you're teaching, especially if you are teaching English and French, which are basic languages. So I just want to say to you that at the Ontario Human Rights Commission, we are talking to the ministers about matters like the PPM 155. We're talking about the PPM. I think there was another one, and we understand that this is a critical time for change. And we are very mindful that we're sensitive about the change, but at the same time, we are working diligently to make sure that all children needs are met. To me, that is very central, and that is the most important thing. So we are continuing to push for change, and we're working with communities, and we will continue to monitor and review the steps that the ministers have taken. I can tell you that I have bi-monthly meetings at the top level to make sure that we are on, we are on I'm trying to find the proper word, that we are on the same wavelength. Then, as we monitor, go along, I didn't want to use another word which might be deemed political, but we are there, and we will continue to monitor. And what I find, and I said to my colleagues at the Ontario Human Rights Commission, that we must take a collaborative approach. There is no point taking a massive enforcement approach, because on matters like these, you want to maximize on the people who are buying in. And when you take an enforcement approach by saying, you must do this, people do it because they think they have to, and people do not do it of their own free will. And so you get reluctance and you don't get the passion. And I want it all. I think when you do it that way, you maximize on what you're doing. So, as I said before, the time is right to embrace the opportunity to reculture our schools with a human rights focus, and to reset how we can teach our students to read along the way, and to make a better Toronto, a better Ontario, and a better Canada. So thank you all. Alicia, I digress to say thank you very, very much for your passion and for your persistence and resilience in doing all of this. And I think when we work together, we achieve so much. So let's do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia. And I'm going to turn it back over to Joanne. She has a couple more announcements, and then we will announce our prize winners. So thank you for everyone and for joining us.
Una, perhaps you can put the slides up again? That would be lovely. Thank you so much. We were so lucky to have Patricia with us today. Thank you, Una. We would like to just let you know that we have some upcoming events happening. And one of them is this coming Friday, 2 days from now. For free, you can register for a webinar. Perhaps, Una, you can move up to this slide that says Rapport sur l'enquête, le droit de lire suivant les recommandations. As you know, there was an announcement of a mandatory screening for children K-2, and that applies for French as well. And so we will be discussing this. Ron Cadez has undertaken a very extensive project in Manitoba with early screening in French, French as a second language. But as we know, French first language, Francophone students in our province are in a minority situation and often benefit from immersion tools. But Francophone tools will also be discussed. Lise Leroux will be discussing teacher training, and Michel Miner-Corriveau will be discussing the actual right to read report in French and the some of the challenges related to it, and all of our tasks that we must undertake in order to achieve the recommendations. So, and last block of the day, I will be sharing resources, French resources that are related to the recommendations of the right to read, all in French. So we would love it if you'd want to sign up. The sign up is on our website. And now could we back up? And thank you, Una, again. There we go. We'd also like to tell you that if you didn't know, pre-service teachers can take our Basics of Decoding and Spelling course for free. And the course is only $65 anyway for anyone else who wants to take it. And the authors of the course have just finished writing a guide guide or a manual to accompany the course. So it's a coaching manual, and we will be releasing that very soon. All right, just want to let you know the good news. And our next Becoming a Literacy Leader webinar will be November 30th. So save the date. We would be so happy to have you again. Also, as you know, a recording of this webinar has been done or is being done and will be available for free. Also, the French literacy resources on our website have been updated. There are more decodable, French decodable resources listed there. So you're welcome to check our website. Una, would you like to go on? Thank you. Oh my gosh. This is, you are the first to hear this because we haven't released it yet. On April 15th, 2023, we will be hosting a live conference. And we just want to let you know, Christopher Such will be our main speaker. And so he is the author of which book, Una?
The Art and Science of Teaching Primary Reading, which is a very commonly used book club book across Ontario. And we are so excited to have him join us.
So save the date. Registration details are coming very soon. And it will be a first come, first served basis. That's right. And now our next slide, Una.
Do you want, sorry, Joanne, forward or back? Do you want the UFly one?
Forward, I believe. It's for our winners. Oh, sorry. Nope, the winner slide. I apologize. Yes, we have two manuals, UFly Foundations, University of Florida Literacy Institute. Teachers are raving about this. Our panel teachers tonight were discussing this. Kate uses this. I know many teachers who love it. Una loves it. And we have two winners this evening, and they are Grace Kenny from Ottawa Carleton and Liz Adamson from Limestone. Congratulations, and thank you for attending tonight, Grace and Liz. And now for our very last slide. Thank you. Great, Una. All right, consider becoming a volunteer with IDA Ontario. We will need help for the conference. We need help for many, many things that we do. Again, we're mostly volunteer run, but we do have three precious gems we've been able to hire. And one is Melinda Fiore, and she's our she's part-time, but I'm almost working full-time, sadly. But we're very, very happy to have her. Melinda is helping us tonight. If you must imagine the amount of work that goes into putting a webinar together. I didn't know until I was doing this. So Melinda, thank you so much for all your hard work and for being always reliable for us behind the scenes. We have a colleague of hers who is Brittany, and we have continued help from Caitlin. So thank you, all of you. But we do rely a lot on volunteers, and if you could join, we'd really appreciate it. All donations are welcome because we have no funding aside from your donations and the course registration. So we really appreciate your help. Our mission will never finish. We will always continue to help people with dyslexia, our children and adults. So without further ado, Una, do we have anything else to say?
Not from me.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for being with us this evening. And we look forward to seeing you maybe Friday for our session in French, although that French session will be recorded and available for free as well. All right. And if not, November 30th, and we'll see you then. Thank you so much, everyone, and good night.